Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Denver Dialogues. Today, a conversation on U.S. congressional reform. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver and co-host of the Denver Dialogues, along with my colleague, Professor Nazneen Barma, who is director of the Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School. The Denver Dialogues is a series of conversations hosted here by Korbel and Scribner in partnership with four of America's premier think tanks, which is intended to model civil discourse on major issues facing the nation and the world. So let me start by thanking our think tank partners, the American Enterprise Institute, the Aspen Institute, the Hoover Institution, and New America. Thanks so much for supporting this series and importantly for lending us your most impressive experts who are joining us today. Naz will introduce our speakers in a moment, but let me just say we have a stellar panel and many thanks to you for being with us today. I should say that the Denver Dialogues is one of many programs at the Korbel School and Scribner and indeed at the University of Denver that really seek to promote civil discourse and even more broadly to strengthen democratic institutions. Truly, a healthy democracy requires that we can engage in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree, and that we're open to the possibility that we might learn something from each other, and that we share a common commitment to facts and to evidence-based solutions. And we believe universities like the University of Denver have a unique position and indeed responsibility to advance those principles. So with that preamble, I yield the floor, as they say in Congress, where I worked 30 years ago, to my colleague and co-host, Professor Nazneen Barma, who will introduce today's program and our distinguished panel. Naz.
Thanks so much, Fritz, and thank you so much to our audience and to our distinguished panelists for being here with us today. As we were planning our content for the Denver Dialogues this year, it became abundantly apparent to us that having a conversation about Congress would be exceptionally timely. It seems like every week there's a new crisis in Congress to talk about. Last week, it was the potential of a government shutdown, which was narrowly inverted. Just yesterday, and relevant to those of us here in Colorado, particularly Congressman Ken Buck, one of Colorado's congressional delegation, announced that he would be leaving Congress early, not only narrowing the Republican majority to really a razor-thin edge, but kind of throwing many different things in Colorado and in the country into a new mix, shall we say. So the conversation today will focus on Congress, the U.S. Congress, and the extent to which its dysfunction is something that is of a new nature, whether it's been something that we can kind of point to historical times where the Congress has been as beset by problems, and to talk in particular about the legitimacy of the U.S. Congress vis-a-vis our politics in the United States, and some questions about the global stage as well. We have an exceptional group of experts here to help us through this conversation, representing each of our think tank partners, and it is my great pleasure to introduce them. I'll do so alphabetically. We have first with us Dr. Brandes Keynes-Rohn, who is the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor at the Political Science Department at Stanford. Dr. Keynes-Rohn is the founding director of the Hoover Institution Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, and her research focuses on some of the issues that we're going to be discussing today: representation and accountability, including projects on elections, campaign finance, and populism. Next, we have Charlie Dent, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program and Vice President at the Aspen Institute. Congressman Dent served 7 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 15th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, which includes the Allentown area. And in his addition to his role at the Aspen Institute, he's a frequent political commentator for CNN, MSNBC, and other media outlets, and was a former visiting fellow for the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. We have joining us from New America, Lee Drutman, a senior fellow from the Political Reform Program at New America. He is the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America, and The Business of America is Lobbying. Great titles there, Lee. He is a co-founder of Fix Our House, a campaign for proportional representation in the United States, a reform of the voting system. And he is a co-founder of the Center for Ballot Freedom, as well as a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Advanced Governmental Studies. And last but certainly not least, we have Philip Wallach, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies America's separation of powers with a focus on regulatory policy issues and the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. In his latest book, Why Congress?, Dr. Wallach defends the centrality of Congress in America's constitutional system, traces the roots of current dysfunction, and suggests how the institution might be restored. I read only brief portions of their illustrious bios, all of which are available at our website, which our colleague Katie Aker will plug into the chat right now for anybody who wishes to take a longer look. But as you can hear from even those short introductions, this is an exceptional group of people to have the conversation that we're about to have. We've collected audience questions via submissions as you were all registering. Fritz and I have worked those into our questions as we're about to proceed, and we will leave about 25 to 30 minutes at the end of our session here to bring in more audience questions. So please feel free to put those questions into the chat. We will work them into our conversation. But for now, I will turn it back over to Fritz with thanks.
Great, thanks, Naz. Well, Naz, you teed that up well. I mean, this Congress is shaping up to be perhaps one of the least productive in history, at least in terms of number of bills passed. And as you said, you know, it's been tumultuous to say the least. You know, speakers deposed and can't get a speaker for quite a while, and government shutdown possibilities. And I would point to the kind of shocking legislative inaction on you know, issues that we agree are important: immigration reform, the border issues, Ukraine funding, the situation in Gaza. We could go on. Not to mention yelling at the president in the State of the Union. It's certainly a different place than when I worked, as I worked in both the House and the Senate as a staffer many years ago. So the question is really, you know, how bad is it? So let me start with Congressman Dent. Charlie, you were there at another moment. You watch it very closely. From your perspective, you know, how bad it? I mean, obviously we've had problems before, and you know, there were other moments in our history where things were pretty dysfunctional, but. I guess the question is there something, is it particularly bad now? Is there something distinct about this period that's particularly dysfunctional?
Yeah, we've reached a really low point, to be sure. The fact that it took 15 rounds to elect a speaker, and then, you know, you've seen on the House floor that the majority, in this case, Republican Party, does not have a functional majority, you know, can't pass rules to bring up bills. I mean, just for the audience, you know, a rule vote is something, if you're in the majority, you're expected to vote for that, to allow a particular measure to be considered. And now we have members of the majority not voting for the rule, which means essentially they're undermining their own majority. So this is really kind of unprecedented. We had, I think, 6 or so rule votes that went down this year. So it took 15 rounds to elect a speaker, rule votes going down, near government shutdowns, and this only able to do the most basic fundamental tasks of government, that is not you know, not defaulting on the nation's obligations on the debt ceiling, not shutting the government down. So those are things that have been done. They've been able to, you know, do that they prevented those things, but that's about it. Then, you know, of course, a speaker has been removed for the first time in, I guess, well over 100 years. First time that has happened. And then, you know, we went through another round of trying to elect the speaker. It, you know, went through 3 or 4 candidates the time they finally agreed on Mike Johnson. And now here we are again, though, where, you know, new speaker, same problems. And I would only say that what we're witnessing now in Congress is a continuation of what I certainly experienced since, I'll say, 2010, 2011. We started to see this type of rejectionist politics, that is, at least within the Republican Party. You know, after the Tea Party came in, there were a group of folks who just, you know, were good at telling you all the things they could never do, and that they would not, you know, they didn't have an affirmative sense of governance. And that's, I guess that's okay if you're in the minority party and you don't have to vote for anything. But when you're in a majority party, that really creates a problem. And so that's what we've witnessed. You know, John Boehner dealt with it, although he did it with a much larger majority than is what Speaker Johnson and Kevin McCarthy had to deal with. And with a tighter majority, a slimmer majority, it's these problems become much more pronounced, because on any given day, just a couple people can raise a stink and really try to grind the gears of governance to a halt. And what's even more interesting, and then I'll stop. I think it's worth noting too that for the few things that have gotten done this year, the debt ceiling, these continuing budget resolutions, and even the recent appropriations measures that passed last week with a 2/3 vote, these all required bipartisan agreements, and they needed Democrats to pass these bills, and in some cases they needed Democrats to help bring them up for consideration on the House floor. And the Senate, the only thing I'll say about that is the Senate has always kind of been a bit more, had a bit better of a sense of governance than does the House. Although things are not starting, but they've been deteriorating, and I think they are fast moving in the direction of the House. And should the filibuster be removed, the Senate will look an awful lot like the House, in my view.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Maybe turn to Brandis to see if you agree with the sort of general characterization of the scale of the problem, and perhaps to say a bit more about your own. Already, Charlie, you're beginning to talk about the why of this and sort of what's driving it, but the extent to which perhaps, Brandis, you also see this as having started some time ago and sort of part of a longer term trend.
So I definitely think it's part of a longer term trend, and I want to kind of highlight two developments that I think relate to this trend. So one is that over time, we've actually removed from parties their central role in campaign finance. We thought this was a good idea, or many people thought this was a good idea. Well, we can come back to whether it was a good idea, but we've actually given individual members, we've placed much more of the fundraising role on members. So members now spend and are encouraged to spend by their party leadership much more of their time fundraising. So just as a very minor example, but one leaked document that made it into the press showed, and this was on the Democratic side, and let me tell you, it's no different on the Republican side, but this was that members would spend 2 hours a day on lawmaking. 4 hours a day were on calling constituents for fundraising. And then there were other sort of constituent activities which might not work directly on fundraising, but were the sort of more traditional constituent activities. So if you're not spending time on lawmaking and in committees, and that includes committee work, relatedly, over time, the parties have centralized in themselves the lawmaking capacity. So they're less involved in the direct fundraising, right? They're asking members to somehow raise all this money. And maybe later we'll talk about how do you do that? How do you get attention from all these out of district donors? And yet the parties are centralizing the legislative process. And in the process, removing a lot of it from the committees where it used to be centralized. So, you think about those two trends, and then you can see a world where what members, if they want to have influence over policy, they're thinking it's less the case that they're going to have influence in their committee than they would have many years ago. And the way to do it is to buck the party leadership. So I'm not empathizing with the members that have done that, but, you can see where those two trends would produce this sort of context. And when we see the opposite, such as the, one exception to the trend of low productivity, for instance, the 2022 bipartisan, Safer Communities Act. So we kind of what was considered pretty major gun control legislation, the most significant gun control legislation, right, since the Brady Act. So what did Schumer and McConnell do in the Senate? Well, they let a group of 20 bipartisan senators that didn't include them work together and come up with the bill and produce the bill. So it wasn't in the committee system, but it wasn't the leadership told everyone this is the bill and we're going to leave the other party out. So, when we have processes that use a more traditional, compromise and lawmaking, things happen. Even on very contentious issues such as gun control. But unfortunately, that's the exception today and not the norm in how laws are made.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let me bring in Lee and then and Philip on this as well. And Brenda's pointing to the role of finance and the time spent and the changed role of parties. Let me I ask you, Lee. How do you see this? What would you add to the picture?
So I'll do a +1 on both of those points that Brandes raised. The centralization of leadership power in Congress has fundamentally changed the dynamics of how Congress operates as an institution, and party leaders control much more of the agenda, control much more of everything really, and they are setting up votes to help their party and try to potentially divide the other party. And so as a result, a lot of stuff is off the agenda. I mean, you raise the issue of immigration, which is an issue that actually kind of divides the parties in some interesting ways. And party leaders don't want that to come up for a vote because they don't want to see splits in their parties. They don't want, they want to focus on the issues that divide the parties, which creates a more confrontational and limited agenda. The weakening of political parties, I think, has been a sort of, I mean, American political parties have always been relatively weak and decentralized, but I think particularly in the current era in which it's easier to raise small donor financing through the internet, in which Citizens United and associated court decisions have unleashed all this outside money that people have no control over, and the parties are hollow, empty institutions that just do basically one thing, which is send panicked emails to supporters and take that money and give it to campaign consultants and advertisers to run ads to make people more panicked so they give more money. So that's not what parties are supposed to do. Parties are essential institutions of modern representative democracy, but the two parties that we have now are completely failing at these central connective intermediary functions. Now, I'd add three more factors. One is the nationalization of our politics, which again is a trend that has been played out over the last several decades, but more and more people are focused on what's going on in Washington, and that is now filtering back to the states. That people, it used to be, people would say, well, I might vote for Democrat for Congress or Republican for president or the other way around. But now people are voting very much on a party line because they care who controls Congress, and they care about national issues. And there's just this high stakes. Every election is a razor's edge election, which adds to this nationalization and hyperpartisanship and agenda conflict. And then the third thing is the geographical sorting of the parties, right? I mean, you go back, 60 years ago, and there were conservative Democrats in rural America and the South. There were liberal Republicans throughout New England. There were a lot more Charlie Dent Republicans who cared about governing. And there was a real overlap of the parties. There were really more like a four-party system with liberal to moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats alongside liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. And so on different issues, you had different coalitions. The coalitions were a little bit more fluid. And as politics has nationalized, as we've had these close elections, and as the parties have sorted geographically, we now have two parties with very little geographic overlap. So we have a record few number of states and districts that are two-party competitive, and yet at a national level, we're at this razor's edge. And the parties are much more limited in who they represent. New England does the New England congressional delegation does not have a single Republican. So there's no Charlie Baker Republicans. There's no Phil Scott Republicans, in Congress. And the Democrats are much more concentrated in the areas that they represent, and that creates no overlap, high stakes conflict, And that has contributed to the centralization of party power in Congress, but the parties themselves are largely hollowed out institutions. And a key part of that is also that because you have so few competitive districts, I mean, why would Democrats set up shop in rural Texas? They're not going to win any elections there. Why would Republicans set up shop in New York City? They're not going to win any elections there. So you have this bifurcation of the parties, and the other thing is who stays in Congress and who leaves Congress. So I look at the people who are retiring, every year. I look at somebody like like Mike Gallagher, seems like somebody who could have been a reasonable governance Republican. I think he came to Congress to do that. And maybe at some point he realized that there wasn't, I mean, I'm not inside his head. But I look at Patrick McHenry, I look at a number of the more governance-minded Republicans retiring, as well as some of the Democrats. And I look at who's coming to Congress and why. And it's not people who want to govern and work on problems. It's people who want to get famous on social media or cable news and engage in performative conflict, and that's very dangerous.
Well, we've covered, thank you for that. You and colleagues have covered a lot of territory. Philip, I will bring you in as well. Wondering what you might add to that or emphasize from your perspective.
Philip, you're muted.
I like what all my colleagues said quite a lot. I would just zoom out a little and say, what is politics supposed to be all about? It's about peaceful accommodation and figuring out how we can work together. Not meaning that we all have to come to agree with each other about everything or even on the deepest issues. It's figuring out how we live together even when we don't agree. And you have to want to do politics. If you're dead set against the idea of politics, or you think that the other folks are so bad that doing politics with them would be morally compromising for you, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And we see a lot of that feeling today in 2024 in America. It's not just about congressional politics, but it sure is bad in that context. And there sure are a number of members who seem pretty vocal about the idea that if my partisan enemy is wanting to do something, then that pretty much shows that it's a bad thing to do, and I can't be associated with it. And that might involve just passing the bill to fund the government, right? There just seem to be quite a few, and I do think there's a block of Republicans in the House that's the most obvious practitioners of this style of almost anti-politics. But I would say it's a broader phenomenon, and I do think it distresses me that there are a lot of folks on the left who would like to say, Republicans trying to regulate whether you have to have your driver's license to vote are bringing about a new Jim Crow, and they're worse than it was 75 years ago. And these people should be drummed out of our politics entirely because they're just so awful. Sorry, you just can't conduct politics like that. You can sling your arrows. It's okay. Call your names. But at the end of the day, you can't say, no, I'm unwilling to work with you, even when we agree with each other, because you're so bad. And, unfortunately, that is kind of the style that gets promoted from the top down these days. The leaders tell their members, don't work across the aisle. That's not like something members have to read in between the lines. They're just told that. Because why would you go work with these purple district members, the few of them that exist from the other party? We want to beat them in the next election. Why make them look good by showing that they do bipartisan things? Just hang them out to dry. We'll beat them and take their seats. And that mentality, that's not so unique. There's always that angle playing, but it's very dominant today. And at the end of the day, I feel like to change this, to turn it around, members just have to get fed up. And I do think there are a lot of good members. Some of them are leaving, but a lot of them aren't. And I think they feel reduced, especially in the House. I think a former member used the phrase glorified telemarketers. And they don't want to be glorified telemarketers. These are people who came to politics to do important things. And Madison said, our system of separated powers works when ambition counteracts ambition. When we have a Congress that's animated by a desire to do things in the national interest, not just be sort of a sideshow to what goes on in the executive branch and the judiciary. And so members know that. They know that things are not great right now, and some of them want to turn things around. So that's my great hope, is that their ambitions are there as a resource for turning the system around. Now, that said, the incentives for ambitious people are bad, as my co-panelists have already said. Like, whatever you think of Matt Gaetz, he's a very ambitious guy responding to incentives, and he's done very well for himself responding to the incentives that he has discerned. And so if we want to change what kind of behavior we get out of ambitious young members, we need to work hard to change the incentives.
Well, thanks for all that, and set the table well. A lot, if only a little depressing, but we're gonna turn to that. But let me turn to Naz to pick up on that and ask the next questions.
Good. No, thank you. A lot of really kind of interesting diagnoses and, thinking about root causes on the table that we'll come back to in our conversation. We did want to ask, we are the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and one of the things that we think about here a lot with respect to the sort of questions about the U.S. Congress is the global impact of congressional dysfunction. And so, Charlie, I'd like to kind of come back to you to kind of kick this one off, to ask, how you think our legislative dysfunction affects our legitimacy on the global stage. And one of the things, most recently that Congress has been gridlocked on, two things, for example, are the Ukraine funding bill and sort of, what action, could and should be taken on the crisis in Gaza. And so, I'm just thinking, Lee, you mentioned Mike Gallagher, who I've sort of have pigeonholed, perhaps incorrectly, but as a national security Republican, a traditional sort of, internationalist Republican. And your point about the resorting of the parties and their identities has sort of impacted the ways in which parties also kind of the roles that they see for themselves on the international stage. And so I'd like to ask Charlie again, sort of how you think this function is affecting the United States legitimacy on the global stage.
Well, an interesting question. I remember, I don't know, several years ago, maybe it was in 2013 or 14, maybe 2015, I was in Europe speaking to some parliamentarians over there, and they always looked at America and said that, these guys will fight with each other, they'll disagree, but at the end of the day, they'll figure it out and they'll get it done. They always do. And then at that time they said, but now we're not so sure. And that was in 2014 or 2015. They saw some government shutdowns, near defaults, and they could just see that things were turning badly. Then of course came Trump, and and all that's happened since then, January 6th and so forth. And they see the current dysfunction, and it really does represent a threat to our nation's security. I mean, just look at this debate on Ukraine. If you want to look at anything at all, there's this growing. Sorry, the lights just went out. I apologize. I don't know what happened. I'm sitting here. Hold on.
We can still hear you. Probably a motion sensor issue. There you go.
I have to move, I guess.
The Russians are meddling.
Yeah, so
they're listening in.
So what happened? I guess what I'm saying to you now, that the Ukraine funding, there are over 300 votes to support Ukraine in the U.S. House of Representatives, but a small faction within the House Republican Conference is preventing the majority of the entire House from taking up a bill. There used to be a time where we let we let the House, let the members have their way, call the question, have a vote. That's how things get settled. But it wasn't just on Ukraine funding. I mean, the speaker is under tremendous pressure not to bring up a bill that he knows will pass overwhelmingly. I saw the same thing with the speaker vote recently. There were the candidates who finished second were withholding their votes. They were withholding their votes to to the one who won the actual party nomination, to be the speaker. In other words, they were undermining their own people, and so in other words, they were trying to subvert the will of the majority of their own conference. So I think people overseas are watching this with horror, and of course, when you add on I'll say this kind of neo-isolationist movement, the protectionism, and to a large extent the nativism, driven largely by migration politics. I mean, this is not simply an American phenomenon. This is happening in a lot of other developed countries, so this is not unique to us by any means. But they see this growing trend, and there is real concern that we as the United States, we can't support a key partner like Ukraine. We reject this authoritarian menace of Vladimir Putin. This is a fairly black and white issue. This is not a hard one, and we still can't get there. And of course, how does China view that? They see dysfunction, and if we can't agree on Ukraine, how are we ever going to agree on Taiwan, which is a much more delicate issue in many ways, militarily and politically than is the case with Ukraine. And how are we going to be able to deal with that? And of course, Iran feels emboldened. They think we've left the field in many cases. And you look at sub-Saharan Africa, many parts of the world, they say, hey, America doesn't show up. It's not that they like the Chinese more than us. They're the only game in town. And they kind of say, we don't have much of a choice. We kind of like you better, but you're not here. And, the Chinese are here. So I think our congressional dysfunction, though, is clearly, is sending really bad signals throughout the world right now. And I do worry that, as we move into a multipolar world, or a bipolar, maybe a multipolar world, that things will only get more dangerous. And then again, as I mentioned, with the whole protectionism, isolationism, we behave that way until some event changes the calculus. Just like Pearl Harbor did. We were in an isolationist, protectionist moment too, in the 1930s, leading up to World War II, and then the Japanese attacked us, and guess what? Things changed, and after the war, we kind of developed this bipartisan consensus, at least in terms of America's role in the world, at least relative to the Soviet Union. And we had a consensus. I feel like we don't have any consensus anymore on foreign policy. And the old adage that we kept our differences at the water's edge. We didn't take them overseas, and well, that seems to have been blown apart many times now. So it's tough. And one thing I just wanted to follow up on, I think, was something that Lee said previously, that the parties used to be much more diverse coalitions. We had ideological diversity within both parties. That is not much of the case anymore. There's such a demand for conformity that I think it has hurt. It has hurt both parties in that sense. The fact that there's this expected conformity. When you had some diversity in the Democratic Party, the progressive wing couldn't they couldn't jam the Republicans because they couldn't get their own members on board. They had Southern boll weevils, and they had rural Democrats who just weren't going to go along with some of that stuff. By the same token, Republicans could never jam the other side for the same reason, because they didn't have a whole bunch of ideologically right-wing guys. They had a lot of people who were much more moderate and weren't going to go along with that agenda. So it forced them into some level of bipartisan cooperation, which helped them both domestically and in the eyes of the world. So that's a kind of a long answer to the question, but we are definitely being disadvantaged right now, and our paralysis at home is sending signals that we are not able to act internationally when the world is demanding that we do.
Thank you, Charlie. Really kind of, disturbing diagnosis of that paralysis from the perspective of our traditional allies and our kind of global security sort of positioning. Brandis, I'd like to ask you to come in on this as well. I mean, you're a scholar of political economy and its effects on things like populism around the world and so on. And so I'd like to ask you to reflect, on sort of the example that we're setting to other countries, right? I mean, can we continue to be the city on a hill if this is how we manage our own affairs? And also to ask you, to reflect on the sort of economic dimensions of sort of a lack of, strong U.S. leadership on global economic issues, if you will. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I agree with everything. I think everything Charlie said. It's unusual to agree with everything someone said, so I'm gonna go back through every word, but certainly the gist of it. And you know, it's common, just as a first note, for in a democracy, you know that there can be a change of power, right? So you know that a signal sent at, that Johnson feels he has to step down in part because of turmoil over the Vietnam War, and that I'm not taking the side of anyone on that. I'm just saying, that political pressures can sway foreign affairs. But we're in a very different situation here, as Charlie pointed out, where the support for Ukraine is very strong. So the issue isn't the public is up in arms and wants us to not give funding for the moment, right? It's that some members are holding this up. That's a very different level of uncertainty from a democracy than other countries are, I think, is a typical case. So that's not ideal, because the other parts are just the trade-off between democracy, right? That's a part of a democracy that the public could rise up. So that brings up huge issues in terms of other countries counting on us, not just the Ukraine, but European partners and other partners around the world. I think that's a concern. And then the second issue that you brought up is, what's the example we're setting? There's been a rise of populism, and while there are a lot of definitions of populism out there, a consistent theme is the argument that someone comes to power who claims that they are sort of going to protect people against the system that has some element of corruption and or not representing the people, and that more power should be vested in the executive against something like a legislature that's has much broader representation. And one of the issues with our dysfunction in Congress is that the president in the United States, and this exists across both parties, has stepped into the vacuum. And many would argue necessarily that when Congress doesn't act on an urgent issue, someone has to act, right? And so the president can come in. But when you think about the population, sometimes that's a good thing. We're attacked at Pearl Harbor and the president needs to jump in, to build on Charlie's example. But, other times when it's sort of built with this sort of me and only me can save you from all of these other corrupt politicians who are just looking out for themselves. And we see this all across the world. If the US Congress isn't acting in a responsible way, it does lend credence to the kind of populist and even authoritarian tendency. And you do hear these arguments, even in our own major newspapers occasionally, that, wow, look at China. There's been a little less of that recently, I'm happy to say, but, look at them. They're making decisions for the long term, right? If our Congress doesn't step up and do their job, those arguments become harder to dispel.
Thank you so much, Philip and Lee. I don't want to foreclose on you both also taking a stab at this question, but I know that Fritz has a follow-up question, or a kind of a new question that will still give you an opportunity to weigh in on this. So Fritz, I'll flip it back to you to get your issues on the table. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, what we want to do is, we painted a complex picture about the many trends, many things at work that have led to where we are, and just a conversation about at least one dimension of the consequences of that, certainly for U.S. standing in the world, and obviously for our ability to solve problems at home. Did want to turn to the kind of, what do we do question. And here, I mean, I guess there's a deeper question of that reverts back to the first one, which is, how great a crisis is this? And it was implicit in the subtitle of the session, democratic reform, evolution or revolution. And so, it may be the case that we're going through a period of time and the pendulum will swing back, and that this will at least partially self-correct. But as I'm listening to you, it sounds like this really does reflect deeper, more structural issues that require some kind of intervention. And so we could turn to that and try to articulate at least some of the things that could be done, hard as they may be to actually accomplish. And so, whether there are reforms in the way in which the Congress itself operates, filibuster, bastard rule, motions to vacate, or in the electoral system, term limits, electoral processes, gerrymandering, the like, or in the broader society. So let me turn. We'll start with Philip, and then come to Lee, and then come back. Actually, I think all of you. I'd love for all of you to weigh in on that question. But let's start, Philip, with you.
Okay, good. Leave the bomb throwers to follow up. Listen, first I would like to say a word on the Ukraine stuff. I think we should realize that the U.S. still has given more foreign aid to Ukraine than any other country in the world, and it did so with a remarkably little degree of bipartisan dissension, which emerged fairly late in the game, in part because I think people have some reasonable questions about where is this all going? This doesn't seem like an emergency anymore. This seems like a conflict that's going to drag out for years and years. The prospects of Ukraine securing a quick victory, have now receded, and we just a lot of folks say we need to take the time to debate this and say what we're doing it for and what we're trying to achieve, and that doesn't seem crazy to me at all. So I think some of what's going on can be a healthy part of a normal process in dealing with this as it becomes a protracted conflict and not just an emergency. I'll say another word about emergencies more generally. I think when we look at policymaking in the 21st century, Congress has shown repeatedly that it acts very quickly in emergencies. If the leaders of both parties are willing to recognize something as a threat to the country, they all recognize it that way, and they want to empower the president to react, they get together and go in a back room and figure out a deal and bring it to the floor of each chamber very fast and get it passed through real fast. We passed trillions of dollars of COVID aid in April of 2020, right? We're coming up on the 4-year anniversaries of it. It's remarkable how fast our political system moved when it thought that there really was something that demanded speed. You could wish for even more speed, but it really was pretty fast. So I think that remains latent in the system. And when we talk about immigration and when we talk about Ukraine, part of what makes these more challenging is that people don't exactly agree on the extent to which they're an emergency that demands action now. And people justifiably feel like the rhetoric of emergency gets overused. And presidents are always finding emergencies everywhere they look as a way of justifying sort of browbeating Congress. So, having said all that, where do we go from here? What do we do? I'm hopeful on the evolution front. I really do think that when you look at the long sweep of congressional history, our situation seems less unfamiliar. When you look at sort of the idea of party leaders becoming a bit stagnant in their sense of what's possible in politics, they get overthrown. We see parties finding ways to dislodge those leaders who are shutting down possibilities and open the door to new coalitions to act. That's what happened. A seminal moment in the history of the House of Representatives in 1910. Most Americans don't know about this today, but it's really a celebrated example. Boss Cannon, Speaker Joseph Gurney Cannon, a great figure of partisan loyalty, bestrode the House back then. He was really, he called all the shots as a close approximation of the truth. And eventually progressive Republicans who wanted to pass regulations on railroads that he wasn't interested in, they said, okay, we're breaking your rule. We're blowing things open, and that's what they did. They famously overthrew him in 1910. That kind of thing is still very much possible today. I think when we look at what's happening in the Republican Party this year, it looks very ugly indeed. and there is not one member of the Republican Party who thinks that they have fixed things in going through the tumult of 2023 and 2024. But I think it's still possible to hope that they're in the midst of a process of transformation and possibly regeneration. Part of this, and I'm sure Lee will say more about this, is a sense that our parties themselves are stagnant and we need some disruption. The question that Lee and I like to debate is whether there are sort of resources sufficient to break up the stagnancy within the system as it exists, which I'm hopeful about, or whether we need something bigger. And so with that, I'll turn it
Oh,
over.
you teed up Lee beautifully. So Lee, something bigger?
Well, Phil and I have had many of these conversations. So, you know, I think, and I do want to recommend Phil's book, Why Congress, and because he has actually a pendulum diagram in the book, talks about how Congress goes from periods of centralization to decentralization and back, and we are in another period of centralization, but there have been periods in which Congress was much more decentralized and much more committee driven. So there's nothing, you know, often things feel stagnant and stuck, but you look at the broad history of both our Congress and our democratic institutions, and there have been a lot of changes, and there will be more changes. And then the question is, what kinds of changes should we anticipate? Because there will be changes. Now, I mean, we're talking here about Congress, but it's really hard to take Congress out of the broader politics that we're in. And you know, if I had to say what is the greatest threat to American democracy, it's not, you know, Congress struggling to pass a budget. It's an election in which, you know, 60% of the country thinks that if the other side wins, this is the end of America as we know it, and maybe we will engage in violence. It is a former president who has incited violence running again with now more support and people who have completely sort of somehow managed to forget that or disregard that. And one of our two major parties saying, oh yeah, it's okay, you know, oh, he just talks about dictatorship, but he doesn't really mean it, does he? He talks about, you know, using violence and putting people in jail, but you know, that's just Trump. Like, I mean, the unwillingness of people in one of our two major parties to you know, call out what seems to me a fundamental threat to the continued order of liberal democracy, that seems to me a crisis. But you know, I recently co-authored a report called "Democracy Hypocrisy" with with Democracy Fund. And you know, one thing when we look at people's support for liberal democracy, it is very fair weather. That people that Democrats are willing to endorse executive overreach when a Democrat is in the White House. So, you know, it just so happens that it's been a Republican who has gone in a liberal direction, but I think there would be willingness on the side of many Democrats as well. So that's the fundamental threat, and that's the environment in which Congress is operating. I mean, Donald Trump is a presence here. He's not in Congress, but he shapes how many members of Congress are thinking about how to behave and who wants to be there, and the general tenor of the Republican Party, and this sort of hyper-partisan conflict where people no longer see opposing partisans as the opposition. We disagree, but you know, you're good people. No, you're dumb, you're evil, and we have to crush you. I mean, that you really can't have a democracy when half of the people think the other half of the people don't deserve to win elections. And like, I wonder, are we a democracy? I mean, so much of what and you know, I am a Democrat, and you know, and I agree that Donald Trump and the Republicans as constituted now do pose a serious threat to democracy. But if the idea is that only Democrats can win elections and we don't, or else we don't have a democracy, then we don't have a democracy, because a democracy is a system in which parties can lose elections. And sometimes it's hard to tell. Maybe I'm just a product of the panic of the liberal media, and maybe, maybe I'm overreacting. So, but it's hard to tell. And if I were to say, well, maybe Trump's not so bad, to some of my liberal friends, they would say, yeah, well, we can't be friends anymore if you feel that way. So it's a very challenging moment. Now, Congress is, part of that system. And to me, the core issue here is the way that our politics have become flat, one-dimensional, and binary. And that's a function of the way our two-party system has nationalized and sorted, and the way single-member districts that we use to elect Congress have reinforced that. So my, big transformative solution is that we should change the way we do elections in this country to make them more like a proportional representation system with multi-member districts. And so instead of single member districts, we combine a bunch of districts, and then you can have a diversity of parties running that represent the broader political spectrum. I also think we ought to re-legalize fusion voting, which was once widely legal in this country, and allows parties to make multiple parties to endorse the same candidate. And that would allow say a moderate center-oriented party to have a ballot line, and it could play a pivotal role in a lot of elections and pull the parties back to the center a little bit, and also create a new identity. I mean, Brandis was talking about the importance of political parties and the way in which political parties have completely lost control over the core functions of elevating and nominating and supporting candidates. We need to give that back to political parties. But the problem is that the political parties that we have right now have become so pathologized in so many ways, particularly the Republican Party. But these parties are incredibly old institutions. We need a little innovation in this space. We need some new parties that can organize new models of how to be a political party in the 21st century, and how to connect with voters, and have the ability to put forward new identities that match the times and aren't trying to hold together these clunky coalitions that don't always make sense and are really only held together by negative partisanship. And maybe Philip's right, and there are ways within the system to get back to some of that multidimensional politics that made our system work well enough in an earlier era. But given the nationalization of our politics, I don't see how to get there without changing the electoral institution, so that we change the way that people engage in Congress and how they build coalitions and how they see the possibilities for governing.
Hey, well, thanks for that. I know we want to come to some of these broader issues around the context in which Congress operates, the polity, the divisions, the sorting, et cetera. I do want to make sure, though, Brandon, since you were certainly invoked, and Charlie as well, just to see whether there are other things you would add to the menu of things that we might want to really focus on, whether in your case around parties or anything else you'd like to raise.
Well, on the issue of, I guess something that I'm not sure if it was Lee or Philip who raised the issue, but I got to tell you, we don't have I feel like we don't have much of a system of separation of powers anymore. It's a separation of parties. That is that the congressional party of the president, feels it's their job to do whatever it must to help that president. I'll give you two very specific examples where each party failed miserably. The Republicans when Donald Trump wanted to move military construction funds to a border wall. Now, we can have a debate whether you think a border wall is worthwhile, but the point was he cannot move funds that have been appropriated by Congress for one purpose without a vote of the Congress to move it for something else. And Republicans, for the most part, melted and gave Trump what he wanted, did not object. Similarly, the Democrats just and that was about $3.5 billion worth of funding, billion. Similarly, the Democrats recently on student loan forgiveness. Joe Biden wanted to forgive, get this, over $400 billion of student debt. Now, we can have a debate whether there should be loan forgiveness. I'm not talking about the policy, whether it's good or bad. I'm saying I thought it was an outrage that an executive could appropriate $400 billion essentially without a vote of the Congress. And now that went to the Supreme Court and they threw it out 6-3. I was shocked it was an unanimous decision. I mean, it was a clear trampling, in my view, of Congress's Article 1 authority, just as Trump tried to do, except this was on a scale of, 100 times more than what Trump did. And I just, not a peep from anybody about this. I just thought it was an outrage. And so this is Congress surrendering its own power of the purse authority to the executive branch. I mean, the vote shouldn't be about the policy. It should be about institutional protection. We're protecting our prerogatives here. I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen that, in a different time, we would have stronger members of Congress standing up there and saying, hey, the leadership in particular saying, you can't do that. And it would be a bipartisan thing too. Let's have a debate about forgiving $400 billion of student debt. Let the Congress vote on it. If they do it, great. If they don't, well, that's the way it is. And so those are the sort of things that I see happening in our system. And we can change. And I agree with Lee that our politics is broken. I'm not sure how to fix it. I think the primary system's a mess, personally. That I never liked that we have this system where that basically that's nowhere in the Constitution, obviously, but the way we nominate candidates is what's creating, I think, a big part of our problem in terms of the types of people we end up electing, particularly when you have gerrymandered districts that allow for the more fringe elements to break through in a crowded multi-candidate field in the primary. So that's just another little pet peeve I have. But the separation of parties as opposed to separation of powers is a real problem.
Right. Well, Brandis, I want to give you the last word in this question, and then turn to let Naz jump in. And I know we wanted to talk a bit about the broader context in which the Congress operates. And I do want to remind people to put questions in the Q&A. We will come to you shortly. So, but Brandis, floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. Well, there's at least two types of reforms that I think we need from on top, and then we'll talk about sort of these broader societal issues. And in each case, I'm trying to roll up my sleeves and be at least propose and be part of it. So I do think that Congress itself, Phil mentioned that we have a lot of members who themselves would like to see changes. And one of the issues that I'm helping co-chair a House Rules reform project with the Sunwater Institute and others, and Philip has helped and jumped in to be a part of that. It's a bipartisan task force. We're trying to propose rules that either party would want, that's serious about kind of lawmaking and your earlier questions about how do we, and it includes former members, former staffers. So I think we need to reform the House rules. Obviously that has to come from, only Congress can do that, but we can, as the academic side, can provide some historical context and some systematic evidence as to what may be helpful, and give those members who want to do this a little bit of, I guess, intellectual ammunition, but some ammunition to go in with. The second thing, which others have mentioned, is reforming the electoral process. My own research has focused on campaign finance, as Naz meant, although I see that as complementary to some of these other types of electoral reforms. And I'm part of a task force that my colleague Larry Diamond is co-chairing. Lee, I think you're on another part of that. I'm on the campaign finance part, so I'm not on the electoral. Yeah, I think you're on the electoral reforms part.
I'm chairing the proportional representation subcommittee. Not surprisingly.
Okay, so there's a number of reforms that will be coming out publicly soon from that task force. I think those are the long lists that I won't go into here for time reasons, but I think the big thing is we need to think carefully about what we're doing in Congress on the rules, and also on the electoral side, that in each case is sort of discouraging serious lawmaking in many instances, but not all, as many of us have mentioned.
Thanks, Naz.
Thank you. We've spent, quite a bit of time appropriately talking about the sort of institutional trends that have made this dysfunction come to pass. Each of you has kind of pointed to a few key things, and some of these kind of more institutionally focused solutions. But we wanted to, as Fritz just suggested, kind of broaden out the conversation to sort of how and whether the congressional dysfunction represents a deeper dysfunction in American society. To not to put a fine point on it. This set of questions actually came to us from a number of people who submitted questions before the event. And the way that I'll frame it is that one potential interpretation of what we've been discussing here, congressional dysfunction, is that the hyper-partisan, radicalized nature of Congress is a mirror actually of our increasingly polarized and acrimonious polity. Lee said this a few minutes ago, that if you have kind of half of a polity kind of the mind, that if the other half wins, then we're in an outright kind of crisis that might lead to political violence, then we're really in trouble. And so I'd like to ask maybe Charlie, if you would sort of weigh in on this to begin with, if some of the root causes, at least, of what we've been describing lie in society as well, and Congress is simply responding to changing societal norms, what responsibility do we as constituents have, in addition to you all as experts, to kind of trying to address this problem?
Yeah, I think citizens have a responsibility to change the channel or go to another news site or source, because one of the reasons why we're so polarized is that people get their information from sources that reinforce their existing opinions or biases in many ways, and they don't, everybody, they don't, the guy watching Fox News is never going to turn on MSNBC and vice versa, and there are various news sources out there too that have a perspective. And if that's all you're doing, if you're just mixing news and opinion, that people have biased sources, you're going to have a view of the world. And I think that's not a small part of this problem. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I would watch members of Congress, get nervous because, somebody on talk radio, is smashing a proposal, and it generates a few hundred calls to their office. And I said, it's usually the same couple hundred people who are making the noise. And you have to be able to tune that out. You have to tune it out. And so many members were unable to do that. They just, they're fearful of their constituents in many cases. And I said this about the leadership too. I used to say this: many elected leaders in Congress were afraid of their members, and a lot of the members are afraid of their constituents. And sometimes you just have to stand up as a member of Congress and explain why you're doing what you're doing. If you can't explain your vote on supporting Ukraine, you ought to find another profession. It's pretty damned easy why you want to keep Russia out of Europe. I mean, given what we went through in the last century with, tyrants, running roughshod and millions of people being killed. I mean, it's not a hard issue. I mean, these are not difficult choices. It's just a matter of members of Congress being able to stand up and justify what they've done. You'd be shocked how many people will listen to them. But maybe I've only been out 5 years. Maybe it's gotten so bad over these last 5 years that you can't even have these conversations. I mean, I can have town hall meetings and tell people things that they didn't always want to hear, try to say it really nicely, listen to them, be solicitous. But I think that's a problem that a lot of members are simply afraid. They don't know that they don't always understand they represent an entire constituency, not just those from their party. And a lot of members only have to really talk to that base. See, what's unusual for a guy like me is I represented a congressional district that had, I was just explaining this to my colleagues who are in very safe seats. I said, let me explain math to you guys. I need 90% of the Republicans, 85 to 90%. I said, I need over half the independents, and I need anywhere from 20 to 30% of the Democrats to win. That's my math. And I said, I can't get there by carrying on like you, Congressman from Ruby Red District. Can't do it. And that's like, I might as well have been talking to somebody from Mars. I mean, that's how, that's not their politics. Theirs is just holding that base together. Doesn't really matter how they do with independents or Democrats. They're in. You know, so, I mean, so that's part of what we're dealing with, this really partisan media environment and many members in safe seats. The incentives are all wrong. There's no, this stay hard, close to the base. Compromise gets you killed. So they stay away from it.
Yeah, thank you. And you teed me up perfectly because I wanted to pivot to Philip to kind of come in on this question. Philip, you said at the outset that there are members of Congress who want to do the right thing, who want to govern, but the incentives just work in the wrong way. Charlie used the phrase rejectionist politics, which I thought was so evocative. Brandis also mentioned how, you know, what the job description of what members of Congress actually do is different. And so the question about sort of to the extent that they focus so much on fundraising as opposed to lawmaking. So the question of sort of how that sort of motivational change, you know, could and might take place in the context of this sort of broader social, polarization is something that I would put to you, Philip. I'm sorry, you're muted again.
I am. The media environment is a big piece of this, and I don't need to tell everybody about how social media virality works. We all know, and that's just a very powerful thing, distorting a lot of aspects of our communal life today. And it's I don't know that there's any going back to the days of local newspapers being the primary source of information that most citizens have about their members. The local media has withered, and it's just not how people consume the news mostly anymore. So that is a fundamental shift. You know, I think we have to think about the rewards to being. There's an old metaphor that goes way back before social media of show horses versus workhorses in Congress. Maybe in any kind of organization, there's always going to be some distinction between show horses and workhorses. That's okay. That's part of the way human beings relate to each other. The problem is partially today that the workhorses just don't feel like they have rewards for doing their work. It used to be that committees gave them their best chance at actually being influential. You become an expert, you work on the committee, you find common ground with the other workhorses from the other party on your committee, and you find things you can do together. And then through the regular order, you get that bill to the floor and it becomes law, and you've made the world, you've made our legal system a more sensible, functional thing. Today, there's just too much of a sense that that bill that you work so hard on with your colleague might go nowhere. And so we really need to ensure that we are focusing on the ways that the rules can support workhorses in their efforts. I think there's a lot of things we could do to make people guaranteed that they're going to get that vote, instead of just wondering if the speaker is going to wake up on the right side of the bed and have that be the only thing that they can depend on. So there's that side of it. But yeah, I think we're right to have anxieties about sort of how do we think of ourselves as a nation at all, right? I think that's something that's changing in the modern media age. I think it was, frankly, World War II had an awful lot to do with how easy it was to think of ourselves as a nation for most of the remainder of the 20th century. I think that, we sort of had that in common, no matter what else we shared, that we fought the war, or our fathers fought the war, or my grandfathers fought the war. But look, young voters today, like they don't know anybody who fought in that war. It's become ancient history. And I think that really has a lot to do with how much harder it's gotten to sort of conceptualize what is it that holds us together as Americans. And we got to get our politics working to figure that out, because it's not an automatic thing. And I do think there's a lot of forces pulling us apart. So yeah, I think it is. I think we face a real challenge, and it's not unique to our country, but I think we're coming up into a hard time for it.
Thank you. And let me just kind of maybe wrap up this particular kind of line of questioning by bringing in the question from Cindy Sestrick. Thank you for posting it and kind of pose it to Brandis, which I'm sort of interpreting the question of, has the sort of modal member of Congress changed over time in a way that sort of prevents us from kind of, reforming along the lines that Philip is suggesting is necessary? Are there a new set of motivations, that bring in members who are less focused on governing, who have less knowledge about the business of governing, and sort of how do you see that?
So I do think that we're seeing the incentive switch. If we tell members that this is what most of your job is going to be, a huge part of it is, I think Philip mentioned the term, was it glorified telemarketer, or so that you're going to get a very different set of people, not just who enter, but who want to stay once, because you can see some people thinking, yes, I'm going to fight that system. And then if they feel that there isn't sufficient support for them fighting it, or that they have to spend too much time on the telemarketing part, they may leave and say, I'm going to retire. So I'm less, I've had other colleagues, so I want to both support the question, but acknowledge that I pushed back on this, although the jury is out. We said this needs to be examined empirically. I've had colleagues say, oh, the members who enter are less intelligent. And I will say that several of us who study Congress pushed back and said, that needs to be, if the incentives are there for members to behave this way, and they do well by this system, we want to be very careful in assuming it's intelligence, but we acknowledge that the jury is out. I did want to just add one component to your earlier question, since you did say beforehand we could jump in, which is that I think that these societal changes are part of the problem. And I do think that as a society, we haven't fully adjusted to the changes from the internet, including social media, right? This is a massive change in how we communicate with each other, with our representatives, and how the media interacts with us. And yes, it's been around now for around, if we want to put, people, the early 2000s or 2005, where you want to put the big shift. But in the scope of US history, that's a very big shift. And I want to note that that's the same time that our civics education in the United States, we decided to refocus and spend less on civics education. So I think that at both the K through 12 as well as the collegiate level, we need to think about how we're educating individuals about US civics, and include in that this new media environment. Because, if your beliefs are that the appropriate way to behave is have one-line zingers where you get a bunch of likes, that's going to create a very different set of incentives, independent of everything else that we're talking about, for members, than a world where we have a fairly, even like I said, K through 12 alone, that's where we get, we really can hit people on how to both be a responsible citizen broadly, and how to be a responsible citizen in this new media environment.
Well, thanks for that, Brandon. So I want to bring in a couple of more questions here. So Doug Scribner, who many of us know well. Hi, Doug. Is asking, he'd be interested in your thoughts on proposals to increase the size of the House, and therefore reduce the population of each district. Some modest increases to some have proposed quite, multiples of the current 435. Would this be beneficial, and what might the downsides be? Who wants to take that one? All right,
I'll jump in
on it.
because I co-wrote a report with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that was entitled "The Case for Increasing the Size of the House of Representatives," which is part of the Academy's Our Common Purpose report. So I'm in favor of it. I think the arguments for it are that the ratio of members to constituents has gotten way too high. It's 765 1,000 to 1. That's a lot. It's by far the most of any democracy in the world. And I think a lot of people do feel quite disconnected from their representatives because of that. Now, I'll note that as a fun bit of trivia, that actually when Madison proposed the amendment to the Bill of Rights, the first amendment that he proposed was an apportionment amendment in which he wanted to limit the district population to 50,000 was going to be the maximum for the original House was 30,000 constituents per district. Well, the idea was once it got to 100, they were going to go to 40,000, and once it got to 200, they were going to go to 50,000, and that was as big as any district could get, and came very close. It was one chamber away from becoming the First Amendment, but then it was never approved. And what we actually call the First Amendment was actually the Third Amendment. The Second Amendment was preventing members of Congress from voting on their own pay raise, which later became the 27th Amendment. So that's a fun bit of history. But we as a country, we kept increasing the size of the House as the country increased. Up until 1911 was the last time we did that. So we've been stagnant at 435 since 1911, even as the population of the country has tripled. So I think there's real advantages to doing that. The one thing that I worry about is if we do that and maintain single member districts, we're going to make the gerrymandering problem worse, because we're going to give states more opportunities to draw more districts. And that increases the possibility for gerrymandering. Now, I love pairing increasing the size of the House with multi-member districts. I think they work very well together. And there are actually a number of members of Congress who are interested in increasing the size of the House. I've been actually surprised. I testified before the House Modernization Committee. I was just in a member's office yesterday who's supportive of increasing the size of the House and interested in these broader electoral reform issues, because I think there are a number, as Philip was saying, there are a number of members who really are frustrated, and they are looking at these electoral reforms. So I am for increasing the size of the House. I think it's a great idea. I think you all might enjoy the Academy report on the case for increasing the size of the House, increasing the size of the House of Representatives. We recommend going to 585. I could see the case for going up to 700, although I think you'd have to kind of add that not all at once, but kind of do it over time. And you probably have to build another House office building, but I think there's a parking lot below couple parking lots in a park behind the existing House buildings where there's real estate to build something. So.
Well, the question is, thank you for that. You made the case for it. The question asked if there were any downsides. I'm not going to ask you that. I don't know if anybody of our other panelists wants to push back at all on the idea, or is this unanimously thought of as a good idea?
Well,
Go.
I'll just say I'm not implacably against raising the size at all. I think a modest increase might be a good shot in the arm for the place, but I do worry, and Madison talks about this. I think it's in Federalist 58, maybe 57. He talks about if at some point, if you make an assembly big enough, it starts to take on the characteristics of a mob. And to put it another way, a legislative body, for it to work as a place where the members are actually trying to forge things through personal interactions with each other, at some point it becomes just too big. So China has a Congress. It has 3,500 members. Incidentally, you've never heard of China's Congress because nobody thinks that it does anything important.
Well, that's because China's not a democracy.
Well, honestly, the Congress passes all the laws. It just happens to pass them exactly how the leader of the Chinese Communist Party wants them to be passed.
Because it's a one-party state.
There's even a few people who aren't part of the Communist Party in the legislature, believe it or not. But it's not an important body. It doesn't do important deliberative work, and its huge size is surely part of what makes it so inevitably useless. So I think if you made the House go back to the 30,000 or 50,000 that the framers had in mind, and you did that with our modern population of 330 million, I do, in fact, that would be equivalent to just saying that this House is going to become a rubber stamp for the other actually deliberative parts of government.
Well,
You know-
we're gonna leave that one there. I think, unless there's an absolute urgent thing. We only have 5 minutes, and
Just,
I
I was
did
gonna say real quick, I think
real
the UK,
quick. Charlie.
the UK Parliament, I think, has what, 700 and some odd members? The House of Commons. I think the German Bundestag has 600 and some odd.
Yeah, that's
You
correct.
know, they function. I mean, I don't know. It's just, we could raise the size of the House a little bit. It wouldn't bring the planet to its knees or anything like that. It might be a shot in the arm, as my thought.
Well, I'm glad we have some disagreement on this. That's as we want to model the disagreement and how to do it. Let me. We're just at time about. We have 5 minutes. You each get a minute. I said at the outset we'd probably turn to a question about. It turns out we have an election this year. I believe. I think that's the case. We're in an electoral year. A lot of possibilities in terms of possibly the Republicans taking the Senate seems likely. Democrats have a pretty decent shot of controlling the House. We don't know how either will turn out. And of course, we don't know who will be president. So as you look forward, put on your crystal ball, what would you, let me ask you in a hopeful sense, what kind of, do you have any thoughts that after this election, there's reason to believe that the kinds of challenges that Congress face will be improved because there'll be different kinds of people elected, or is it more likely that we'll just continue to see the trends that we've seen for some time now? And I'll just go around maybe the order we started with was Charlie for starters, and you get a minute.
1 minute. Look, whatever happens after this election, I suspect the majority of the House, if it's Democrat, will be slim. If it's the Republicans in the Senate, it will be slim, and quite possibly divided government. One thing I do know is that whichever party wins the presidency will probably control the Senate, but you never know. And so I think I don't know. I'm not expecting much improvement next year from where we are this year. I mean, probably be marginally better, but we're still going to be kind of in a tough spot.
Brandis.
Well, I'm behaving as if it's possible. As we said, we have this House Rules Reform Committee. So we have to believe that the will is there. I actually think that Philip mentioned earlier that the Republican Party's in a lot of clearly this isn't a great for the party itself to have all these speakerships imploding on the speaker. Whether that would incentivize the Democrats may feel that things have been working well for them when they're in power. So that, suggests maybe power is shifting. There is this sort of situation where the parties seem to be going out and telling their members again, don't compromise with the purple members because we want to beat them. But you do have to step back and ask, are you self-defeating as well? Because the majority keeps shifting a lot. So the hope would be, whether it's this election or the next one, that the parties come to see that it's in their own interest to be viewed as a party that can get things done.
Great, thanks. Lee.
Well, I'll put this in historic context because I don't think we're going to see much change. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you the balance of power will continue to be razor thin, and most parts of the country will continue to be solidly red or solidly blue, and the battle for control will be waged on a very narrow territory. And for going on 30 years now, we've been in this period of pendulum politics where we go from unified government to divided government, to unified government for the other party, to divided government. So we're in this period where we have two parties that are continue to think, oh, if we could just get total domination, we just get everything, and then they get unified government, and then they can't agree amongst themselves, and then they fight, and so there's like this sort of idiocy going on where people keep thinking, oh, if we just do this little thing differently, somehow everything will change. And the definition of stupidity, right, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So, I mean, in that sense, to answer the question of are members dumber, maybe the answer is yes. But I think that the thing is not to see it in terms of the parties, but to see it in terms of the members themselves, because I think there are a growing number of individual members who look at the way Congress operates, look at the way the parties operate, look at the way our politics is operating, and say, this is really freaking dumb. And they are hungry. I mean, this has been my experience as I've been expanding the conversations that I've been having with members of Congress and their staff, that there are a lot of members who are really hungry for structural reform and structural change. And the Democrats are willing to be more outspoken. The Republicans are incredibly scared. So I'm not hopeful there, but at some point something's got to give, right? I mean, we go through these cycles in American politics in which it seems like nothing's going to change, and then all of a sudden a lot changes. What seems rigid is also very brittle.
Yeah, well, you probably teed up Philip well for the final comment in some ways, circle back to points you made earlier. But Philip, you do have the last word. And once again,
much as I love all of the institutions that we hail from these days, I will say that it's my strong belief that in the end, the energy for reform to be sufficient to cause change, to break us out of the status quo, it doesn't come from well-meaning reformers. It has to be coupled with a sense of wanting to accomplish something and being frustrated about the inability to accomplish it. So I think we have to look out for what kind of new things could make people demand that, whether it be a grassroots demand that comes really authentically from the public, or just the members themselves just willing to break up the system because they want to make something happen that they're not being allowed to make happen. So that's what year after year I'm waiting for, and we, the well-meaning reformers, have to be there waiting to help them know what they can do if in fact they want to do it. But it does, some broader political force, I think, has to act on the system to shake it out of its complacency.
well, thank you for that. We'll look for that broader issue. I just wrote an article arguing that maybe at some point climate change is that thing. But anyway, look, thank you. That's a really hard one. That's probably exactly wrong. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Thank you. What a tremendous, wonderful conversation. Thank all of you, Lee, Philip, Brandis, and Charlie, for being with us today. We could talk, and you've all thought about this so much, we could talk much longer, but delightful conversation, really thoughtful. Thank you so much. Now, you get the last word, actually.
Oh, thank you. That was a nice set of reflections on that sort of, the final question. I heard sort of both, realism and a little dose of optimism and pragmatism, in the sense that, you're all working on this set of reforms. We're grateful for that. And just to echo Fred's, this has been an absolutely wonderful panel. Such an honor to have you all with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Nancy and
Good night.
Fred. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.